Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the latest installment of our Coffee Break webinar series. We have hundreds of people on the line, and we hope that you are all enjoying this with a nice cup of coffee. But if not, our discussion itself is equally as stimulating. So today, we're going to talk about KYC, AML regulatory changes in the market, and just how regulators are shifting their focus to regional and community banks. Next, we will talk about trends in recent AML regulatory actions and what banks can do to be better prepared for regulatory exams. And finally, we'll get into how Treasury strategies can help you with your KYC AML program. My name is Adelina Azemi. I'm a consultant in the financial services practice at Treasury Strategies. With me on the line is Kathleen Gowan, a principal. Kathleen, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Adelina, and good morning to everyone. My name is Kathleen Gowan, and I have 30 years of experience in banks, primarily in the payments arena, but I've spent the last several years focusing on the regulatory environment, especially around KYC and AML, and I'm also a certified anti-money laundering specialist.
Thanks, Kathleen. A quick note to everyone who's registered on the session, you will receive a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording in the next couple of days. If anybody has questions or wants to continue the conversation, you can do so in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will respond to these questions offline once the coffee break is over. So, Kathleen, what's going on in the market?
Well, Adelina, as we all know, 9/11 and the financial collapse led to some significant changes in the regulatory environment. And really, there was no playbook for the industry to use to adjust to the new regulations that resulted from these two major events. As a result, major banks worked hard and also worked with regulators, and together they determined the best process for implementing increased controls for KYC and AML. And, in conversations I've had with others in the industry, it's my opinion that regional and community banks believe that their controls right now are adequate, especially since they haven't been the recipient of some of the regulatory actions and consent orders like those that make the news for the major banks. And unfortunately, this has led some of them to believe that their KYC and AML programs must be sufficient. But I might point out regulators learned from these experiences, and now they know what a strong KYC AML program looks like and how it ought to operate. And as they begin to work with regional and community banks, they're finding gaps and areas of weakness. And this is putting these banks at a distinct disadvantage, mainly because they just don't have the staff to implement the kind of controls and programs that the major banks have had.
Yeah, it seems like the regional and community banks were just not under the same microscope, and now they have to play catch-up.
That's right. And remember, there have also been changes in the regulatory landscape, and there's now some overlap with some of the regulatory bodies. We've had the introduction of the CFPB, the OCC absorbed the Office of Thrift Supervision, and FinCEN is taking an even broader and more direct regulatory role, especially in the areas of KYC and AML.
Oh, that's right, Kathleen, and all the banks, regardless of size, are required to comply with the regulations these bodies enforce. Failing to adopt a comprehensive KYC AML program with adequate control really does cost these banks money. If you don't do this properly, you can put a significant amount of the bank's capital at risk. Remember, was it just last year, Standard Chartered was fined $300 million for inadequate anti-money laundering procedures. And who could forget HSBC's $1.9 billion fine, $1.9 billion for failing to conduct sufficient due diligence, which, eventually led to money laundering.
Well, yes, and there have been some regional and community banks for which the regulators have also taken some action. A couple that come to mind right away, Saddle River Valley Bank. They were a very small institution, yet they were processing $1.5 billion in payments to Mexico and the Dominican Republic Casa de Cambios. They were deficient in not properly monitoring the outbound payments. And another one that comes to mind is MoneyGram. And in December, it was the first instance where regulators fined an individual, and he was fined $1 million for failure to adhere to the KYC AML program. And I think the other one that I think about is the First Bank of Delaware. In fact, their bank charter was pulled because of KYC AML program deficiencies. So these are real instances that can apply to the major banks as well as the regional banks and the community banks.
Right, and this isn't only affecting the banks, but the clients as well. I'm thinking of FinCEN's proposed rule around beneficial ownership, which will require banks to gather more documentation. And clients are already frustrated with all the documentation they have to provide. Sounds like this will only exacerbate the situation. So,
Right.
Kathleen, what are the regulators finding in their recent actions?
Well, Adelina, it seems to me that in many of the regulatory actions, there seems to be sort of a common set of failures, and that might be good to cover in this coffee break this morning. First is when a bank just doesn't have a staff that's adequately trained in KYC and AML. And another failure is when the staff really doesn't have the experience to do their jobs, especially if they're in the monitoring or the compliance area. I also look and see that another set of failures is around the suspicious activity reporting and cash transaction reporting. They're either not filed or they're not accurate. And in fact, this has led many banks to have to do what's called a look back, and it's resulting in hundreds, sometimes thousands of amended reports being filed.
Wow.
In other cases, there's just not enough testing that's being done around AML compliance. And then maybe another set of failures is around not having appropriate risk profiling at the customer level or by customer type. So those are some of the common themes that seem to run through some of the major regulatory actions that have been done recently.
Okay. So what can banks do? I mean, how often should a bank review its KYC AML program?
Well, Adelina, they really ought to review that program at least once a year. But there are also times when a bank really ought to step back and take a fresh look at their KYC AML program. For example, if the bank is introducing a new product to the market, or, and as this still happens quite a lot, as banks are acquiring another bank, they really need to take a look not only at their own KYC AML program, but also the program of the bank that's been acquired. I think another time they should look is when they've decided to enter a new client segment, and it'd be important to take a look at that particular client set and the AML KYC controls that are in place. And then perhaps the fourth time might be if the bank is experiencing turnover in their compliance staff. That would be another time to take a look at the program. But, Adelina, one thing I might add here is when a bank is either introducing a new product or if they're entering a new client segment, there really ought to be a thought given to the cost of the due diligence. There could be some significant impact on net income as a result of either entering a new market or introducing a new product. So banks really ought to take a look and do an analysis of their pricing model to be sure that they've covered their cost of due diligence. And by the way, banks can also turn to Treasury strategies for some support.
Yep, you're right, Kathleen. There are many ways that Treasury strategies can help banks who are reviewing their KYC AML program. We have expertise in reviewing existing KYC AML programs to identify and remediate gaps. Treasury strategies has worked with banks to develop governance programs that reach across multiple areas like lines of business, risk, compliance, and legal. We work with banks to develop strategies for adding new client segments and what that means for their KYC AML program. And, actually, we have also helped banks that need to exit an existing client base. So, for example, let's say through an acquisition, a bank now has a segment that is not in their risk profile. Well, they're going to need a strategy for how to exit that segment successfully, and we can help them. And I think one of the most powerful things we've done with our clients is to help them identify KYC AML roles and responsibilities, and then train them to have the knowledge base to adhere to regulatory standards. I mean, I could go on, but unfortunately that's all we have time for today. So for those of you on the line, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Kathleen or myself. We'd be more than happy to continue the conversation. A quick reminder that everyone who was registered for the session will receive a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, and we look forward to hearing from you.